Shifting gears now to the war in the Middle East, where dozens of trapped Palestinians have been fleeing Gaza's Nasser hospital during deadly sniper attacks after Israeli forces ordered hundreds to evacuate. According to eyewitness, Israeli snipers have been firing on anyone who moves in the area, with several people reportedly killed near the hospital. Earlier, officials in the facility said they were suffering from shortage of supplies, even to as little as painkillers. While the hospital is barely functioning, doctors are trying to work twice as hard as possible to save lives. The World Health Organization is now calling for urgent protection to revive the backbone of the health system in southern Gaza. And as fear and panic grip Palestinians sheltering in what Israel considers a safe zone in Rafah, they spent the night not knowing what could happen next. Displaced residents cannot seem to find the right words to describe the situation in the city. For some who spent the night there in spite of the shelling, it was extremely difficult. For others, terrible. The World Health Organization representative for Gaza, Rick Pipacon, says a full Israeli military offensive against Rafah would further expand the humanitarian disaster beyond imagination, and it will push the health system closer to the brink of collapse. He noted that many requests to deliver supplies and medical aid to Gaza have been denied by Israel. Meanwhile, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is alarmed by the deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It follows restrictions by Israeli forces to allow the delivery of aid into the Strip. The UN chief also expressed concern on the number of journalists killed in the course of the 4 months.
Well, I am particularly worried with the deteriorating conditions and security for humanitarian aid delivery in Gaza. There is a breakdown in public order. At the same time, we have restrictions imposed by Israel that are not improved and limit humanitarian distribution. On the other hand, the deconflicting mechanisms to protect humanitarian aid delivery in relation to military operations are not effective. And so my sincere hope is that the negotiations for the release of hostages and some form of cessation of hostilities to be successful, to avoid a all-out offensive over Rafah, where the core of the humanitarian system is located, and that would have devastating consequences.
Israel is, however, denying claims to threaten the safety of South Africa's Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor. It's a response to Ms. Pandor's allegation that Israeli intelligence agents and services have been intimidating her. She said this led her to speak to South African Police Minister Becky Cele about beefing up her security after she received threatening messages. However, Israel has strongly rejected the claim, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying they're baseless and false accusations. The ministry in return now accuses Ms. Pandor of what it calls a blood libel and serving as the legal arm of Hamas. Relations between the two countries hit a new low last month when South Africa filed a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza, a charge it rejected. I want to bring in now retired U.S. Army captain and a national defense and military strategist in Abuja, Captain Bish Johnson. Captain Johnson, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. Let's begin with the South African Foreign Minister's complaint amid Israel's response. Let's imagine that it was true that Israel was threatening the South African Foreign Minister. What would be the gain in that?
Well, I don't see any practical gain. If Israel is threatening their foreign affairs minister, other than a continued backlash against Israeli government with its efforts in Gaza. If Israel is actually doing that, I think that will further undermine the relationship between South Africa and Israel, which you just alluded to the fact that is at its all-time lowest point. But there's no, there's no smoke without fire. For that minister to have come out to say that she's been intimidated or been threatened, I think both South African government and international community should look into that, do some investigation to ensure that the safety of the South African foreign minister is guaranteed.
Yeah, indeed. And more concern now is rising as regards the Israeli offensive in Rafah. In the last couple of days, we've seen, Israeli strikes in what was considered the safest zone in Gaza at the moment. Is it possible that the Israeli Defense Forces targeting Hamas militants are doing this? Is it possible that they can do this without involving civilians?
It's practically impossible. Israel is in a very difficult situation in the sense that they're not fighting a conventional force. What they're fighting is, they're engaged in asymmetric warfare in which Hamas people, they're not wearing uniforms. They don't have written on their foreheads, Hamas. So there is absolutely no way Israel will undertake that operation, just as we've seen in all the previous operations that they've carried out without civilian casualties. So there will be civilian casualties, unfortunately.
And that might also be because, the IDF says that we have, that Hamas militants are actually using civilians as human shields. They're living amongst the people, so it might be a bit difficult to do that. But while the IDF says it's only targeting Hamas, it appears that this offensive includes not just targeting Hamas militants, but also infrastructure built by Hamas. I mean, this offensive has gone as far as Rafah, meaning that, the intelligence of the Israeli army tells them that there is something in that particular city that might be to the advantage of Hamas.
Yes. This whole operation, the whole situation, like I said earlier, is a very difficult one for Israel. I don't know how they can actually do it because each time civilians are asked to relocate, they don't just relocate on their own. As they relocate, Hamas is also relocating with them because, like I said, they are not written on their forehead that these are Hamas militants. Hamas militants can be anyone. So even as Israel is insisting that they want everybody to relocate because they want to carry out some military operation in Rafah, it's not guaranteed that Hamas militants won't relocate to a safer zone and to a different area with civilians because, as we have seen throughout the whole course of this operation, and that has actually been their modus operandi, to embed themselves in civilian infrastructures among civilians as a way of, protecting themselves by so doing endangering the lives of civilians. So exactly the same thing is going to happen in Rafah. The much Israeli military can do is that they are able to take out one or two militants, and then they're able to degrade the capability of Hamas in terms of the infrastructure they have in Rafah. But as far as eliminating all of Hamas in Rafah through their military operations is not going to happen because as civilians are relocating to safer zones, the militants are also relocating with them.
Yeah, and you've heard the outcry against Israel, with the number of people killed, the number of civilians. We get updates every day, from the Gaza Health, the Gaza Health Ministry, talking about how many people have died every time. And, those numbers go up to sometimes 100 and sometimes just scores of people. Should Israel take responsibility for the thousands who are displaced in Rafah and possibly for the number of dead?
I don't think I got the latter part of your questions. The last I heard was the numbers going up. If you don't mind, could you please repeat yourself so that I'll get the full questions?
We've heard, you know, the numbers going up, the number of dead every time the Israeli forces attack a particular area. And then the Gaza Health Ministry tells us the number of people dying growing up. Do you think that Israel should take responsibility for the thousands of people displaced, not just in Rafah, but in the rest of Gaza, in Khan Yunis and the other major cities in Gaza? Should they take responsibility for the displacement and for the number of people killed in these areas?
It is very difficult for Israel to take responsibility for the displacement of civilians and the casualties that's been recorded in the course of the military operation in Gaza. Because this is what really happens when you engage in urban warfare. There's no way in urban warfare where you're not going to have very large number of civilian casualties, because urban warfares are usually concentrated in population centers. And so there is one of the most difficult warfare for any military to engage on. No matter how much caution you take as a military force to reduce collateral damage, the truth is that there will be collateral damage. And you have a situation where Hamas themselves are embedding themselves in population centers where civilians and civilian infrastructures where civilians dwell. So the collateral damage as a result of that oppression is going to be high. Let us not forget how we got to where we are today. How did we get to where we are today? We got to where we are today because Hamas breached one of the most highly protected borders on earth, went into Israel and murdered over 1,400 Israeli citizens, civilians, some of whom are actually on the side of, having two states side by side as a solution. That's how we got to where we are today. Had Hamas not gone into Israel on October 7th, these military operations that we're talking about in Gaza right now won't be happening. So we shouldn't forget where this whole thing all began. It all began October 7th. So if you ask me who takes responsibility for all the civilian deaths, including the ones that took place in Israel and the ones that are taking place in Gaza right now, I would tell you that Hamas should bear responsibility for all the death, because it was their action on October 7th that led to military incursion into Gaza by Israel.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure the aid groups or even the UN will agree with you. But I want you to speak to the availability of supplies, the medical and otherwise, in Gaza. These aid groups are saying that Israel, the IDF, is not allowing any of them in. The hospital in Nasser is under pressure. They don't even have painkillers. Most of the doctors are working overtime with very little supplies. Should Israel allow this to continue while it continues to negotiate, hopefully, with the Hamas militant group, the senior leaders who live outside of Gaza, on a middle ground regarding ceasefire, because that is necessary to allow the aid to come into Gaza and to allow people who need this medicines, who need food, who need basic supplies to be able to get them?
Yeah, I think, for humanitarian reasons, and we're all humans, I think we're all seeing what is happening in Gaza. Innocent people are suffering. There shouldn't be collective punishment for all the people of Palestine, because not all of them are Hamas. So there should be that flow of humanitarian aid into those places where they can be, they can get to those who really need them. The difficulty the Israeli Defense Forces is facing is that, sometimes when these humanitarian aids, are delivered to Gaza, they end up in the hands of Hamas. And this has been their constant complaint. Until the international community, including the United Nations, can come out and guarantee the Israeli Defense Forces that whatever humanitarian assistance or aid that is being delivered to Gaza will not end up in the hands of Hamas militants. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to make that case that Israel should allow humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. It's a difficult thing. Even as you are letting humanitarian aid into Gaza as a force, based on what they have stated to be their objective, you have to also ensure that those humanitarian aids that are being delivered are not being used to make bombs. You have to ensure that those humanitarian aids don't have military, military assets in them, thereby assisting Hamas to, rebuild their capacity and continue to be a resistance force against Israel. Look, it doesn't matter whether the United Nations or the other governments agree with me, but the truth of the matter is that we wouldn't be where we are today had Hamas not gone into Israel on the 7th of October. This is where it all started. And as a country, Israel has the right to defend themselves. If Israel does not degrade Hamas to the point that Hamas does no longer pose a threat to the state of Israel, we will continue to be in this cycle of violence. Because if Israel withdraws now, tomorrow, if you've had the leaders of Hamas stated in their comments that they are ready, that they will carry out the same operation they did in October 7th. So those kind of bombastic rhetoric are the reason why Israeli forces and the Israeli government wants to ensure that they eliminate them completely so that they no longer pose any threat to them. Just like the United Nations and her coalition eliminated ISIS. And so it's a very difficult situation. We understand the plight of innocent civilians, innocent Palestinians. I hope that the Israelis will find, a balance in where aids are delivered to people, innocent people that really need them, even as they continue to maintain the blockade to ensure that there are no military materials or material being brought into Gaza in which Hamas could lay their hands on and begin to build their capacity back again.
Captain Johnson, I'm just wondering, if there's anything to be learned from this war that's going on between Israel and Hamas, especially as it relates to, us here in Nigeria, where the military has been fighting insurgency for years now. And, I would say, that there is some military fatigue there, having fought for so long. What is the lesson, that the possibly Nigerian army or military can learn from what's going on?
Well, the situation there is a bit different from what we're facing right here, because what we're facing right here is much more of a homegrown terrorist organization, which, took a while for us to get to the point that we are right now. Because there is no question that Boko Haram capacity has been degraded. The Nigerian military has done a fantastic job. It took a while because it's a new experience for them, and they don't have the kind of firepower and capability that the Israelis possess, to get to where we are right now. However, insecurity still persists in Nigeria. So the lessons that has to be learned is that to deal with whether they are ISIS or Boko Haram or Hamas, it has to be a consistent pressure and a force applied on them. The only language that terrorists understand is language of force. You have to put that pressure on them by way of military operation and on them consistently. You don't let off. Anytime you let off, they use that opportunity to rebuild their capacity and capability and continue to carry out, their terror of deaths and bloodbath, So you have to continue to put the pressure on them. And to do that, you need constant intelligence. The Israelis have been successful in so many levels with their operations in Gaza because they went in there and they are able to obtain a lot of military intelligence information in which they had applied in subsequent operations in Gaza. So what we have to do is to look at what they are doing, although theirs is a little different because they are actually fighting outside their own territory, so they can afford to obliterate a whole entire city or neighborhood without, having to regret it. In the case of Nigeria, Nigeria couldn't do that because the operation will take place in Nigeria. Any collateral damage will be Nigerians that will suffer that collateral damage. So Nigeria has to do surgical, tactical operations so that there are no collateral damage to Nigerian citizens. So it's a much more difficult situation for Nigeria than it is for the Israelis. But nevertheless, there are lessons to be learned. And that lesson is that you must apply consistent force on whether they are terrorists or bandits or whatever we want to call them if you want to succeed.
Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain, thank you again for joining us on The World Today.